Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. What should you do when an unexpected heavy frost or freeze damages your plants? How can mulch save you water? And those extra ingredients that you find in fertilizers and potting soils, are they worth the expense? What's a good soil recipe for starting seeds? What's a good soil mix for growing blueberries? Why is soil pH important? How can you get seeds to germinate more quickly? How can you tell if those old seeds are any good? What's an inexpensive way to protect young plants in the garden in early spring? Hey, what about eucalyptus and cedar wood chips? Are they okay to use in the garden as mulch? How do you mulch around irises? Why do you need a fan blowing on young indoor seedlings? By the way, how do you control soil grubs? Whoosh, that's a lot of questions. Well, America's favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower, and myself provide the answers or opinions at this, a live mid-February recording at the Elk Grove, California Garden Club. A splendid time was had by all. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast live. Well, sort of. Brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Let's go.
A lot of you have probably heard Farmer Fred on the radio and imagine what he looked like. Well, now you know. Anyway, today we are honored to have two very special guests. Not only one master gardener, but two master gardeners to come and educate us, help to educate us. Fred Hoffman, a.k.a. Farmer Fred, has been a master gardener for many, many years. He started out in radio a long, long time ago, and when he was in college, and he's done other things besides gardening shows. He was, a DJ or a host for many, many types of music. And I think people that are on radio have that radio kind of voice. That radio voice. So it doesn't matter what you're talking about. It just sounds good. Our other speaker is Debbie Flower. And Debbie Flower is a retired professor of horticulture and she taught for many, many years at American River College. I was reading up some of her, some things about her, and I think the most exciting thing about being a teacher is when you can inspire a love of what you're teaching to other students, and that was pretty much what I read about, that Debbie had inspired love of plants and horticulture onto her students. So without further ado, our very honored guests, Fred and Debbie.
Well, thank you very much. I think you can hear me without a microphone. And actually, Susan, I'm going to put you to work later on during the question portion of our program. You can walk around with the microphone and get the questions from the people so they don't have to stand up and shout like we do. All right? Thank you. We are recording this for the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, an incredibly popular podcast, much to my surprise. I've been doing it since April of 2020, and it has grown by leaps and bounds, and for a very good reason. This woman has been on that podcast since the inception, Debbie Flower, who has taught at local colleges, at American River College, at Sierra College, at Folsom Lake College. Where else?
Place called the Skills and Business Education Center, which is part of the Sac City School District, had a hort program taught there.
She has a heck of a big fan club of former students who just love her. And she's very gracious to join us here today.
Thank you, Fred.
To talk to you. Oh, by the way, if you don't know where the podcast is, but you know how to find a website, the website is gardenbasics.net. The alleged topic we are here to talk about today, spring garden tips to save time, money, and water. And there are a lot of ways you can save time, money, and water, and we will just go through some of them. Any of you lose plants in the last couple of weeks because of cold mornings? Yeah, or you think you've lost plants. They look sad. My best friend in the backyard, Chuck, looks sad. It's a Brugmansia, Charles Grimaldi, and Chuck is looking real sad. And that's what happens when you try to, grow plants that are out of your zone. You look at a Brugmansia, and Debbie, what is that, about a zone 10 plant? Really, it's semi-tropical. And here, as long as the weather stays above 30, you're fine. But once it gets down into the mid-20s, like it did a couple of weeks ago, we are starting to see some very sad plants.
And mine had started blooming. My Charles Grimaldi. Was yours in bloom?
Oh, yeah. It was in bloom because we had warm weather.
Oh, I love it. And then you go out the next day and it's put.
So what would you do to save time in this regard?
I wouldn't touch it. The dead parts on top are going to protect what's below. So if there's more cold coming, and Fred was telling me the 50-50 date in Sacramento for chance of frost being 50% is February 15th. I think of March 15th, or March 17th, because that's St. Patrick's Day, and it's always easy to remember holidays, as a date when our average last frost. But Fred was also telling me that we had a frost April 12th of last year. So it's unpredictable. But what happens at night, sun goes down, and if it's a clear night, the heat from the earth starts coming up and it just keeps on going. If you put something in its way, a porch roof, some frost cloth, or dead plant parts, then it traps that heat underneath whatever that is, the porch roof, the dead plant parts. So if your plant has suffered some and you have dead plant parts flopping over, they will act to protect from future frosts.
I was reading this morning a garden tip from an orchardist who has early blooming apricots. You mentioned you have an apricot tree in bloom. Yeah. With frosts coming more until the latest frost ever recorded, well, we set the record last year, April 12th. I know anybody listening to this on the podcast and you live back east, you're laughing because you're not safe till what, Mother's Day?
Or my son's in Minnesota.
Yeah,
still
well, that's
snow.
4th of July or thereabouts. But this orchardist was saying that he protects his apricot flowers during the time of the year when it's in bloom, because apricots bloom so early, there's always a chance of them being affected by the frost. You lose the flowers, you lose the fruit. What he does is cut off branches of evergreens and covers the plant with them every year.
Wow, that's labor intensive.
That's labor intensive, but you're going to get apricots.
Yes.
And it's cheap.
Yes. And
this orchardist wrote this in 1785.
Holy smokes.
So it was just based on his observation, but this goes back to Farmer Fred Garden Rule number 8. If it works for you, fine, but keep an open mind. And now you just have to convince yourself to embrace the ugly.
Mm-hmm. A couple of seasons of that in California. The very end of the summer when everything's dried out and dirty because we haven't had any rain and things just aren't happy. You have to embrace the ugly. My daughter-in-law, who used to live here, didn't like that time of year. And I said, well, she lived in Ohio. Wherever you live, there's going to be a season that you're not going to enjoy your yard. For them, it's winter. For us, it's that time of year and then this short period in spring when we have the ugly frost damage.
Another garden tip to save you some time and money and also build up the soil is something I've been doing the last couple of weeks, and that's shoveling chipped and shredded tree parts as mulch throughout the yard, throughout the garden, because a mulch, put it down now for 2 to 3 or 4 inches deep, and it's going to improve the soil and do a lot of other things.
Right. It doesn't prevent seeds from germinating, but when they do germinate, they have only a certain amount of food in that seed to get up to the sun when they can make their own food. The food is in that seed so the plant can get up to the sun and start making its own food. If it has to get through 3 to 4 inches of mulch, most annual, for sure, weeds peter out before they get through the top. So you don't have weeds. Then, I was doing this yesterday, I have chipped mulch, and it's very prevalent right now because of all the trees that are down and the arborist companies that have been making the chips. They have to pay to get rid of those chips. So if you track them down or you call the company, or there is a chipdrop.com, you get on their list and they'll call you and say, well, we have it coming on this day, and you have a place for them to put it, you can get it for free. So I've been doing this for many years, and the weeds that do come up in that mulch and mine is a couple of years old, in the location I'm thinking of, are very easy to pull because that mulch is very open. So I actually took a chair and was sitting on the chair pulling weeds, and then I moved the chair and pulled some more weeds. It doesn't have to be hard, but it saves lots of weeding time in the present and in the future.
And it saves water, too, because
Absolutely.
It's insulating the soil. The water is going to stay near the roots longer, which is a two-edged sword depending on your soil type. But also, it's like a thermal blanket for your soil, too. It keeps the temperature above what it would normally be in the wintertime and less what it would be in the summertime.
Right. And the thing that holds water in your soil is the organic component of the soil. It's not the sand, silt, and clay. They hold a very thin layer of water around them. But if you want a bunch of water held in your soil, you have organic matter in it. And that's going to come from the mulch you lay on top. You don't have to dig it in. You don't want to dig it in. It's a lot of work, and it messes up your soil structure. Just lay it on top, let nature take its course, and you will have added organic matter in the soil, and that will hold water. We did a lab in soils class when I was teaching, and I had to go find clay or soil without organic matter and dry it into nice clods. We all know what clods are. And then soil with organic matter and dry that into clods. And then the students had a metal net basket, and they lowered it into a beaker of water and just watched. And what happened was the one without organic matter, the soil just fell apart. The one with organic matter absorbed the water. It's the organic matter that holds the water in your soil. So you can get a lot further into summer with a lot less irrigation if you have organic matter in your soil.
How many of you have clay soil? Yes. Yeah, I used to live in Harold, so I know all about clay soil. It gets cursed at a lot. But actually, Debbie, who's the president of the Clay Fan Club, would
Yes.
tell you that clay's actually a good soil to have.
It is. It has it's called cation exchange capacity, its ability to hold on to nutrients and give them up to the plants. But you have to know how to manage your clay soil. And that's when it becomes difficult. Walking on it, planting into it from a container of organic media that was grown in the nursery. So the number one thing to do to improve your clay soil is to add mulch. It'll take a year or more, but the organic material will get into the clay soil naturally with worms and such, and it will become a much easier to manage soil. Your irrigations will go deeper. It won't get so compacted. And organic matter also has a high cation exchange capacity or ability to hold on to and release nutrients to the plants. Organic matter solves all soil problems.
Notice, too, she used the word worms in there, that the mulch can encourage worms to come into your soil. That's a good thing. Worms make worm castings. Have you seen the price of worm castings lately? Go out and buy a 2 cubic foot bag. It'll set you back $18 or so. It's not cheap. And so why not just encourage the worms to come to your yard with mulch? Because it does improve the soil and makes it very conducive for them to live under.
And they find it. You don't have to find them. You can buy them at bait shops, but only get red wigglers. You don't have to. They'll find it.
All right.
And the beauty is between what you buy in the bag and what you create in your own vermicompost or happens in your garden is there's a lot of live organisms in worm poop, which is what worm castings are, that aren't going to survive necessarily in the plastic bag that's put in a factory that sits in a warehouse, it gets on a truck or whatever, and finally ends up at a nursery in the sun somewhere. By the time you get it, that stuff is dead. There's other good stuff in it, but if you get it done right in your own yard, the fertility of your soil and those live organisms populations, which are good for your plants, are right there.
You've heard me talk about the benefits of Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric container. Smart Pots are sold around the world and are proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Many of the imitators are selling cheaply made fabric pots that fall apart quickly. Not Smart Pots. There are satisfied Smart Pot owners who have been using the same Smart Pots for over a decade, actually approaching 20 years. When you choose Smart Pot fabric containers, you know you'll be having a superior growing experience with the best product on the market. And your plants will appreciate Smart Pots too. Because of the 1 million microscopic holes in Smart Pots, your soil will have better drainage and the roots will be healthier. They won't be going round and round on the outside of the soil ball like you see in so many plastic pots. The air pruning qualities of Smart Pots creates more branching of the roots, filling more of the usable soil in the Smart Pot. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers and select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. The weather may not be perfect for outdoor gardening right now, but it's perfect for planning your 2023 garden. Now's the time to plan the what and the where of what you want to plant for the future. And to help you along, it pays to visit your favorite independently owned nursery on a regular basis throughout the fall and winter just to see what's new. And coming soon to that nursery near you is Dave Wilson Nursery's excellent lineup of farmers market favorites, great tasting, healthy fruit and nut varieties. They'll already be potted up and ready to be planted. And we're also talking about a great selection of antioxidant-rich fruits, such as blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, goji berries, grapes, kiwi, mulberries, gooseberries, figs, and pomegranates. Wholesale grower Dave Wilson Nursery has probably the best lineup of great tasting fruit and nut trees of any grower in the United States. Find out more at their website, davewilson.com. And while you're there, check out all the videos they have on how to plant and grow all their delicious varieties of fruit and nut trees. Plus, at davewilson.com, you can find the nursery nearest you that carries Dave Wilson's plants. Your harvest to better health begins at davewilson.com. Let's get back to our conversation at the Elk Grove Garden Club. We're talking spring garden tips to save time, money, and water with America's favorite retired college horticultural professor, Debbie Flower. Well, you just hit on something that maybe we can do a nice little scenic bypass on, because this too will save you money. You may be thinking about fertilizing your spring garden. And, well, one thing that we like to stress is we think people over-fertilize the garden. But a lot of people are buying soil products and fertilizers that contain mycorrhizae. Do they really? We don't know. Debbie has thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I was really appalled at the price of fertilizer when mycorrhiza was initially put into the bags of fertilizer. It went sky high, and it's not needed. Mycorrhizae are specific. Some have a huge plant range, meaning they'll be effective in many plants. Some have a very small plant range. So the bag will say contains 17 billion beneficial organisms or something like that. They're talking about mycorrhizae, which is a fungal population. And it has been proven that most plants, not the brassicas, so broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, not those guys, mustard, but almost all other plants have a relationship with this fungus, this mycorrhiza. The fungus gets nutrients from the plant through the roots, and it is so small, its stem, quote unquote, it's really called hypha, can travel way further away, faster, and into smaller soil particles than a plant root can. And it'll pick up nutrients and bring it back in water. Everything travels through plants and fungus in water. So in water to the root. So the root gets this nutrient and water in exchange for the sugar it has given away. And so it's a mutually beneficial relationship. But the fungus is very specific to the plant. And again, if you're going to buy it in a bag, the same thing as the worm compost. Is it going to be alive? Maybe, maybe not. Fungus do have a spore stage, which is their resting stage. And they can survive a lot of bad environmental conditions, but not forever and not too extreme. So why pay the money to buy something that, number one, will find your plant on its own? It's like the worms. The fungus shows up. And number two, might not even be the right one for your soil, for your plant, and number 3 might not even work. So
the good news is if you can grow plants, if you have plants growing in soil, you have soil mycorrhizae. And they do a great job multiplying on their own. And so adding to it is just a waste of money because, like Debbie says, it's very plant specific, and chances of that bag of soil or whatever having mycorrhizae may not be a match for your plants. Trust your plants to attract the mycorrhizae that it needs, basically. All right. Speaking of bag soil, let's talk about seed starting mixes.
You're very good at that.
I'm very good at that because I have 2 wheelbarrows. And
okay.
And because I like to mix my own homemade seed starting mix. Why use a seed starting mix to start seeds and not just regular potting soil?
Particle size.
That's it. Just particle size. And the difference?
Well, seed starting mix is a very small particle size. Many of your seeds, if you're starting tomatoes, peppers, are small. Lettuce, minute. Seeds are very small. And if you cover a seed with too much or too large a particle, the plant can't push its way out. And
that's the benefit of a seed starting mix. If you turn over a bag of seed starting mix, you'll see that the usual ingredients are peat moss or the coconut
coir,
or vermiculite, perlite, and maybe a bit of compost throw in. And you can buy it or you can make it. Just do what I do is a 1/3 mix of each. I do 1/3 peat, 1/3 of a perlite or vermiculite, and 1/3 of a finely sifted finished compost. Mix them all together. But what's very important, if you're using peat moss, if you're using any soil mix that has peat moss in it, and many do, it has to be thoroughly moist. It's very hard. It's like a dry sponge. If you have a totally dry sponge and you pour water on it, what does the water do? It runs right off the sponge. It takes a while for water to penetrate a sponge. The same is true with peat moss. And I like the way that you get your peat moss wet.
Well, at school we would do large batches because I had whole classes of students, and we would throw the 1/3 peat or coir, 1/3 perlite, and 1/3 vermiculite on the concrete patio outside, and everybody had a shovel, and we'd do the dance. Shovel and move ahead a step, shovel and move ahead a step, so that everybody's reach is different, everybody's turn is different, so they would get well mixed. But to wet it, we used, you can get chemicals that are wetting agents, or you can use a tiny bit of dish soap, just a little bit in the water, and it breaks down the surface tension of the water and allows it to go all the way around the peat moss or even the coir. Coir was a little more difficult. Coir is the coconut stuff. You can buy it in pellets. If you're going to use it in mix, that's probably the better way to get it because it's been chopped. But you have to soak that overnight. That takes a lot longer. And that was just in a garbage can. We'd soak it overnight. Is that what you were thinking of?
Exactly. Or you take that peat moss or your seed starting mix, and do this too with commercial seed starting mixes, is put it all in a bucket, fill the bucket with water, go do something else in the yard, come back a few hours later, and then take that moistened mud, if you will, and put it into containers that have drainage at the bottom and let them drain for a while, and then you can use that seed starting mix very, very easily. We were talking about this once on a podcast, and you were very specific about if you added a drop of soap, which type of soap to use.
Well, it needs to be soap, not detergent. And most of what we use in our kitchen to wash our dishes in the sink, liquid soap, is detergent. And so you want soap. Ivory flakes is a wonderful thing to use. Dissolve that in some water. That's just soap. So you need soap. There's a brand of soap. You can buy it in bottles, or you can buy a cake of it. And I can't remember.
Castile?
Thank you. Castile soap.
I wanted to ask you about that. I don't know what Castile soap is.
I don't know exactly what it is either, but it's soap.
Okay.
And so you can use some of that instead. The bottles, or you just take some of the bar and dissolve it in water. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, do you add any lime to your seed starting mix?
No, I don't, because a seed starting mix is fairly neutral. And really, does a plant need lime to germinate? Does a seed need lime to germinate? If I have problems in my soil and the pH isn't high enough or low enough, what is it? You add lime to acidify.
To raise it, yeah.
Oh, to raise it or
to raise
lower
it? Peat moss is very acidic. Peat moss runs around 5, a pH of 5.
That's why it's good for blueberries, too, if you want to grow blueberries. Now, the potting mix that I would transfer those seedlings into would be what is more specific to that plant's needs. Mm-hmm. So but it's usually a fairly neutral. Most plants do fine if the pH is between 6 and 7. You want to explain pH? No? Okay.
We can. Do you want to hear an explanation of pH? pH is the negative concentration of the hydrogen ions. Okay? No, I know. pH is a measure of alkalinity or basicness and acidity. And it runs from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral. A neutral pH is a good pH for plants. And I got my bachelor's degree at Rutgers in New Jersey, where we get a lot of rain. We would get 40 plus inches a year. I was taught a good pH for plants is 5.5 to 6.5. So that's on the acidic side. But that's because we were in New Jersey and the natural soil was acidic and the plants that did well there liked it a little acidic. Here, when I came to California, that shifted up a little bit because we're a lot drier, and in drier locations, the natural pH in the soil is higher. But we're all looking right around 7, right? 6.5 is just under 7. So we're looking right in the center, a neutral pH. Things like lemon juice, sulfur in the garden lower the pH. So an acidic pH is below 7, and basic or alkaline pH is above 7. The thing to understand about the numbers 1 through 14 is that when you change from one number to another, the amount of, let's say, alkalinity, if we go from 7 to 8, is 10 times at 8 what it was at 7. It's 100 times at 9 what it was at 7. So each number is a logarithmic scale, if you know your math. Each number goes up a factor of 10. So it's a powerful range from 0 to 14.
It's the Richter scale of the soil, basically. I always like to think of pH as pipelines in the soil, and the diameter of that pipe is dependent upon the pH in the soil. The pipeline is for all the soil critters, the fungal, the bacteria, basically to get to the plant roots and back. They're like nature's little waiters and waitresses delivering food. And it's easier for them if they can stand up in that pipeline and walk through to the plant. If that pipe is too small, they have to crawl at a very slow rate. So the correct pH is going to give you the widest pipeline to get nutrients to a plant.
The biggest pH problem we see here is a soil that is not acidic enough for plants that like an acid soil. Citrus could handle a slightly acid soil, gardenias, azaleas, rhododendrons, and they will have iron deficiency in their leaves, and that is a green vein and yellow between. And it's on new growth, not old growth. It's on new growth. When the new stuff comes out, it's yellow, and you think, what's wrong? It could be just an adjustment of your pH. If you look at fertilizers, we were talking about not fertilizing much, but if you look at fertilizers for those plants, they will be acidic. They will contain some sulfur, and they will, over time, it takes time. Sulfur is not an instant actor, but over time, it will change the pH of your soil and allow the iron to get to the plant. It's not that the iron's not there in the soil. It's just it can't get there. It's tied up in the soil because of the pH.
If you are planning on growing blueberries for the first time this year, and you should, there's plenty of blueberries at local nurseries right now, they are best in our soil to be grown in containers where you can modify that soil to give them the pH they want, which is around 5.5. And the larger the container, the better. I like to use cattle watering troughs. When I lived in Harold, my favorite garden store was Tractor Supply Company because I could buy some big cattle watering troughs there in Gulf and then cut holes in the bottom and then fill it with a soil mix that I knew blueberries would like. So if you're going to grow blueberries, grow them in a container, a large container. It can be in a half barrel or bigger. And one good formula for a soil mix for blueberries includes peat moss that's well moistened, and what's called an RAC soil, rhododendron azalea camellia mixed soil, because that has a lower pH. You can find that at a nursery. And 1/3 pathway bark, the small bark that you can buy in bags. Mix the three together, and you can grow blueberries galore in that because it maintains a pH around 5.5 to 6, which they really enjoy. I guess before we run out of time here,
Let's talk about more things.
Yeah, we should talk about some tips for germinating seeds. I germinated pepper seeds because it's time to start pepper seeds. And pepper seeds are notorious for taking 2 to 3 weeks before you see any green. You have to be very patient with pepper seeds. But I used your tip. I soaked them in hydrogen peroxide for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
What does that do?
I honestly don't know. I mean, hydrogen...
But it works.
You got to be honest when you don't know things, right? Hydrogen peroxide is H2O2, so it's water with an extra oxygen. So I assume the oxygen has some effect on the seed coat, or maybe it oxygenates the baby plant inside. I don't know. We were having trouble at school starting them, and so I just, went to Plant Dr. Google and looked for things. And I always love to experiment. So we tried it, and it worked very well at school. The peppers were up in 7 to 10 days.
Which is about half the time normally. So
right.
Good job. And bottom heat, too, helps.
Bottom heat is wonderful. When I first started with bottom heat, I used the heater that was under a waterbed.
Wow, you're old.
Anybody still have a waterbed? I have one in the shed if you want one. But you can buy heating pads that are specific to starting plants, probably ones that your pets, they sell them for pets too. If you have one of those laying around, that might work. They're probably a little bit warmer. We're looking for something where when you touch it, you can't tell it's warm. But you plug it in, and mine, you can buy little ones. We had big ones at school. Lay it down and put the trays of the seedlings on them. You can do this in a cold greenhouse, a cold frame. You only need the media warm for the seed to germinate. Seeds have all the food they need to germinate, assuming they don't have to go, 6 inches before they reach the sun. They just need water and oxygen and correct temperature. So those heating mats help.
How many of you have old seeds laying around the house? They're in bags and the original container. I've gotten in the habit now of dating my seed packet, so I know how old it is when I go and open it. And then I wonder, are those seeds still any good? Do you have any tips for figuring out if seeds are any good?
We did a lab for that, too. We laid out a piece of paper towel like this, folded it in half lengthwise, laid 10 seeds on the fold, folded it over, wet it, and then rolled it up like a cigar. You wouldn't do it this way. The seeds would all fall out, but you know what I mean. Fold it up like a cigar, laid it in a cup with the fold up. So all your seeds should be up here. It's moist, and then put a cap on of some sort and let it sit on a windowsill. It doesn't have to be in the sun, just in a warm place in your house. And check it. And if the seed packets will tell you they should germinate in 5 days or they should germinate in 10. Check it at least at those times, maybe once before. So you open it up and you count the number of seeds that have germinated. And if 5 germinated, then you know that about half your seeds, your old seeds, are still going to work. And if 10 germinated, they're great. Beans the students who got beans got all germination. The reason for standing it up is that the roots will grow down, and it's much easier to see where they're coming from. If you lay it down, the roots will go all over the place, and it's hard to see which seed they came out of. So it's hard to tell how many have actually germinated.
And not only do the roots grow in a paper towel, they might get tangled in the fibers of a paper towel. So
you could still grow them, but you got to cut and plant that piece of paper towel too.
Or I like to use coffee filters and do the same thing because there's no fibers associated with the coffee filters and they don't get tangled up in that. But that's how you could determine whether your seeds will start or not. Now, I'm really cheap, and if I see that those seeds have germinated, I'll plant them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Students always wanted to. Yeah. It's possible.
Oh, yeah. It works fine.
Just be very gentle with those roots.
In fact, I did that last year with some pepper seeds. And it took about 7 to 10 days in that situation for them to put out one little bitty root. But then I immediately took it and put it into a larger container, about a 3-inch container, in seed starting mix. And lo and behold, in 5 days, there's a plant growing. Yeah, so that works. Speaking of caps, you use the word cap. And I like what you do for your new transplants in the springtime when you set them out in the garden and there's still the threat of wind or rain or hail. By the way, we always get a hailstorm in April. It'll happen. It'll happen. how do you protect those young plants?
I use newspaper. I still get a newspaper, but only on Sunday. But there are all these free ones around town. Go into a coffee shop and you get some. And if the pages are dull, whether they're colored or not, if the pages are dull, not shiny, then that's safe to use. And I just make a little cap out of it with masking tape. It's really safe because the tape and the paper are going to disintegrate. Even if you forgot about it, it would all disintegrate around the plant. It would take a while, though, but it protects them from some frost. It protects them from the sun. If you start your seeds inside or even in a greenhouse, the seedlings are not subjected to outdoor conditions. The sun is stronger when you take them out of the greenhouse or out of your house. The wind is stronger. The temperatures are more extreme. So these caps give them time to adjust to that. Also, obviously, they protect them somewhat. But when you transplant, you're always doing root damage. The only part of the root that absorbs water and nutrients is the root hairs. And they're at the tip. And they're very fine. They're not even the hairs aren't even roots themselves. They're just extensions of the cell wall of the very tip of the root. And they're going to damage them. You can't not by taking the plant out of the container. You should cut the roots, because they might be circling. This is really critical for woody plants. It's not as critical for herbaceous plants. Woody plants, if they're circling, those roots will become woody, and they will become basically underground branches that will choke the tree, and the tree will fall over in the winds we've been having. And so you're damaging the roots just by taking it out of the pot, by doing a couple of cuts on it, by putting in the soil. And so it takes about 3 days for new root hairs to form. So in those 3 days, the plant is it's like you not getting food for 3 days. The plant's just sitting there. So it needs protection from the sun, from the wind, from the critters. And a little cap of newspaper works great.
And if it blows away, no big deal.
Oh, well, it'll decompose. You're not contaminating. You're not polluting your neighborhood.
Let's put Susan Mucky to work and take the microphone for people to ask questions. We are opening the floor up to questions because we are both confident and we'll give you an answer that sounds believable. And maybe to urge you to ask questions, I have an incentive for you. I'll explain that in a minute. Go ahead, Susan. Start. Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, well.
All right.
With all of the recent storm damage, I have about a 100-year supply of eucalyptus wood chips. So can I use those around my roses? Can I use them in a vegetable garden? I've heard that they will kind of poison them. The oils in them will get into the soil and sort of permanently prevent things from growing.
When I was at UC Davis getting my master's degree, there was a field full of eucalyptus. Only they were, trying to figure out what you can do with eucalyptus in California, and nothing grew under it. And the owls would sit up in the trees, and there would be owl pellets. It was a very interesting place to go. And then they took them down and chipped them and used that as mulch everywhere on campus. Nothing came up except baby eucalyptus. There has been some work done by Linda Chalker-Scott at University of Washington. She writes the Garden Myths books. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them.
She's on Facebook, too, with the Garden Professors.
Garden Professors, right. And there's a Garden Myths, I think there's a website. I'm not positive about that. And they did actual research on eucalyptus and said there's no evidence that it permanently damages. It acts as a pre-emergent immediately, so it prevents seeds that are baby seeds. Pre-emergents work by killing seedlings. The seeds germinate, but then they're killed. In the vegetable garden, I would not use the wood. If I had a lot of leaves, I would try it in part of the vegetable garden. What do you think about eucalyptus leaves in the vegetable garden?
I think they're fine under eucalyptus trees, and I would use them for walkways. I would use them wherever you're growing hardwood plants.
The roses would be fine.
Yeah, the roses would be fine. I have the same issue, except it's a cedar tree. My neighbor's 60-foot deodar cedar fell in my backyard. I'm not too happy about that. But I've been reading warnings online about, don't use cedar chips for mulch because it'll dissuade the beneficial insects. But the people mentioning this online, and this is the other thing you should get into a habit too, is if you go searching for gardening information online, is to, in your search, let's say you want to find out information about mulch. Well, just don't put in mulch. Put in mulch and either .uc for University of California or .edu that will bring up a whole host of researched information on whatever topic you're looking for. So this information about don't use those cedar chips because it'll dissuade not only the bad insects but the beneficials was coming from arborists and pest control people, but I couldn't find anything from a university, a study that showed that cedar chips dissuade beneficial insects. I'm a little confused about it, but then I thought about it. Well, how did this get started? And I'm thinking it probably started with Grandma's cedar chest. A cedar chest dissuades moths. Right. Yeah,
I have one of those.
Yeah, moths stay away. Your clothes aren't going to get chewed up. And they transferred that thought to the outdoors. But I think outdoors, there's more external influences that mitigates that repulsion, if you will.
And we're also doing it as mulch, a layer on top of the soil. The only place that there's interaction is right where it touches the soil, and typically things start to break down pretty quickly right there.
One habit I've gotten into, like Debbie was alluding to, is using a hardwood mulch, like chipped and shredded tree parts, beneath your hardwood plants, your shrubs and your trees. And for the vegetable garden, I like to use worm castings or some sort of green waste-based compost.
Includes leaves.
And to a point, yeah.
But we're wary of the eucalyptus leaves.
Well, I know they've done tests on eucalyptus leaves, and it does not dissuade much.
All the evidence, the research says it's fine.
But at what point in the decomposition of a leaf does it turn from green material to brown material?
If it falls off the tree as brown, then it's brown. So it's carbon. If it falls off the tree as green, then it's green, which is the nitrogen component. Because if it's brown, the plant actually reabsorbs the nitrogen back into the plant before it creates an abscission layer, which is a layer of cells that allow the leaf to cleanly fall off. So the green is gone. But if the tree fell and the leaves were green, there's nitrogen in those leaves.
I mentioned there was an incentive for asking questions. So everybody who asks a question, as long as the supply lasts, gets a University of California Cooperative Extension Master Gardener Calendar and Gardening Guide. Well, here's the bad news. It is 2022. But there's charts and information about growing that are invaluable any year there is. So congratulations on that.
I actually have two questions. I have large iris beds,
Mm-hmm.
and with the recent rains, the weeds are just crazy, and it's not something you can go in and hula hoe or anything. I've never put wood chips or anything in the soil around and on top of the irises because they're so prone to rot. Can you use those?
Well, you don't want to cover the rhizome. If you cover the rhizome, they will never bloom. Between the plants, around the rhizomes, but don't cover the rhizome.
How far apart would you keep the mulch away from the rhizome?
You just don't want to cover it.
Okay. All right. So, Andrew, that's generally good advice. Anytime you mulch, is keep it away from the trunk of the plant to avoid any sort of rot issues.
Secondly, you talked about the apricot tree and taking something like a red blue branch after the winds. I've got a lot of red blue branches, and I've got a little grafted tree. I wasn't clear. Were you talking about putting those branches over the top of the tree?
Yeah, basically just laying them in the tree. Yes, you will lose some flowers, but in this gentleman's estimation from 1785 or whenever it was, you do lose a few flowers, but you get a lot of fruit as opposed to not covering it and you don't get any fruit.
And if you were to use a cloth, then you're excluding your pollinator, so you're not going to get any fruit either.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good table.
There's some more back there. They're feeling left out, I think.
I have a few questions. My whole yard, front and back, are covered with shredded cedar.
Mm-hmm.
And I bought it because it would keep away the insects and stuff. So does it actually not harm the plants? Because, my yard is growing really well.
Right. Doesn't harm the plants.
Doesn't harm.
Do you see any beneficial insects? Do you see the hoverflies or the bees?
Bees.
Okay. All right.
And the place you're going to see them is on the flowers.
Yeah.
On the plants.
So then I have another question. In the winter, we grow vegetables in grow boxes.
Mm-hmm.
So this year, we grew we grow the same plants, but they're not growing the same way. So all the bok choy is growing profusely, but my cauliflower is not growing as much. The heads aren't growing, but it's called a cedar cheddar.
Okay, the orange
it's just
one.
really teeny. And the Brussels sprouts aren't growing. So do you have any ideas about what's going on there?
Yeah, you shouldn't be growing cauliflower and Brussels sprouts. only because they're hard to grow. That's a big flower you're trying to produce.
Well, but you know, every year when I grow cauliflower, they're huge.
Right.
This is huge, and mine isn't.
I wonder about restocking the soil in the bed, and I wrestle with this with nutrients.
Okay.
Some worm castings will have mostly the micronutrients. Chicken manure, composted in bags. Don't ever use fresh chicken manure, even if it's dried out and been dried for years and years and years. That needs to be, it's way too strong. It burns everything. My mother emptied her father's chicken coop, which was our playhouse for years. One of them, there were several.
And you lived.
Yeah. And brought that home, and the stuff had been dried for decades and burned everything in the yard with it. So
what do you do?
You throw it in the compost, or you mix it with something else, or compost is best, or compost it alone, but compost.
And how long do you leave it in compost?
A season. It's nitrogen, and nitrogen moves very quickly with water. So you could just, if you needed it immediately, you could just flush it with water. We don't have that kind of water in California, but you could do that.
We have time for one more question, and Sue will run over with the microphone.
When planting seeds in a seed tray with the mat, you put the cover on, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Do you absolutely need a light over it?
Oh, no.
In the house?
No, not for seeds.
No, once the seeds are up, seed germination can happen in the dark. It's when you need strong light and wind once they have germinated. The wind moves the plants, and that creates, you go to the gym to lift weights, to strengthen your arms. The wind moves the stem, and that strengthens the stem, and the strong light helps keep them sturdier, shorter, fatter. But to just germinate seeds, no. So it's a trick. It's kind of, I have a greenhouse now, but when I didn't, I had a table in front of a west-facing window. I had eye bolts in the ceiling, and I hung a two-tube fluorescent fixture. And I think I had heat pads. I had a fan, it was the guest room, a fan on the guest bed, and let them all germinate, then take the caps off. As soon as they're out, the caps should come off, and then rearrange them. So you might start in individual cells rather than 6-packs or big trays. So rearrange the seedlings so the ones that had germinated are in one part, the ones that hadn't could still be covered in the other part. And then I'd hang the light crooked, depending on who's tall. So the tall ones would be under the high light, the short ones would be under the low light, and run the fan. It was an oscillating fan on a timer. Yeah, you didn't want to visit me in seed starting time.
How long would you run the fan?
I ran it about a half hour. It should be 10 minutes. Each plant should be hit by the wind for 10 minutes, and I wanted to make sure they got it, so I ran it for about a half hour.
At what stage of the plant's development would you start that process? Would you do it if it's at the cotyledon stage, when those initial seeds come out?
Yes, as soon as they're out of the ground.
Okay.
Well, I guess that wraps it up.
We got one more question here.
One more question. Okay.
Okay, I have a very small garden, and it always did really good. And a couple of years ago, I bought new soil and put it on top, and nothing grew. Nothing. Grubs is what I looked up in Google. It said they were looking like grubs and stuff. How do you get rid of them?
Birds like them. And what I do if I'm digging and I find grubs, I'll just toss them over my shoulder. The birds will find them. And I thought, well, they'll be back next year. They weren't back next year. It was like the birds figured out that there are grubs in my soil. And it's not unusual for me to look out the kitchen window at the backyard and see a flock of robins all in one raised bed, but they're not picking at plants. They're in the soil. They're digging. So they're going after those grubs.
So to attract those birds, put something tall nearby. It could just be a stake. You don't want them too close together because the birds need to fly, but birds will stand on that. And I don't know if they hear or see or, they have some pretty great senses, and they will find the grubs. They'll stand on that stake, and then they'll find them and dig them out.
We are out of time. These people want to eat. Thank you for inviting us to the Elk Grove Garden Club. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you again for coming.
For many gardeners, especially in USDA zones 8 and 9, midwinter can be a tricky time. Tricky in that really nice, sunny, mild days in late January or February can encourage a plant to put on a bloom. Early blooming fruit trees such as apricots and almonds come to mind, and some unpruned roses might start a show as well. But how often is that late January, early February fling of nice days followed by 3 or more days in a row of sub-32-degree mornings? And you can guess at what happens. And how many of us have been fooled by having this period of mild weather continue with no more frost. You know, you get a few years of that in a row of nice winter temperatures. We just might get the urge to stretch our botanical boundaries and put in plants that may be better suited for the next zone up. For instance, here in USDA Zone 9, we might have been tempted with the apparent success over a few years of winter survival and growth of Zone 10 tropical plants here. Yeah, I'm talking to you avocado growers out there. But what happens? A freeze will knock them back. So what's a gardener to do? Remove all the plants that look frostbitten? Perhaps prune away all those frost-damaged plant parts? Purchase and plant again this month those same varieties of shrubs, perennials, and annuals? Do you water the garden even if the plants resemble toast? Or do you fight the urge to prune and plant by staying indoors, basking in the heat emanating from the television or the computer monitor? We have the answers in today's Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter. For current newsletter subscribers, look for the What to Do About Freeze-Damaged Plants in the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter. It's in your email, probably waiting for you right now. Or you can start a subscription. It's free. Find the link to the newsletter in today's show notes or sign up at the newsletter link at our homepage, gardenbasics.net. The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast comes out once a week on Fridays. Plus, the newsletter podcast that comes with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter continues, and that will also be released on Fridays. Both are free, and they're brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. The Garden Basics podcast is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes our homepage, gardenbasics.net. And that's where you can also sign up for the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. That's gardenbasics.net, or you can use the links in today's show notes. And thank you so much for listening.